Astrology. Man, we've been looking up at the stars for answers for thousands of years. And today, it's a massive, multi-billion-dollar industry. But, it's also one of those topics that really divides people. You've got passionate believers on one side and total skeptics on the other. So, what's the real story here?
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get into what astrology actually is, beyond just the daily horoscope. Then, we're going to see what happens when science puts it under the microscope. And finally, we'll dig into the psychology of it all. Why is it still so popular?
Okay, so for most of us, the way we first bump into astrology is probably through our daily horoscope, right? That little blurb you see in a magazine or, that notification that pops up on your phone.
So check this out. Here's one for Sagittarius. On the health front, you may indulge in comfort eating. Sound familiar? It's that classic style, isn't it? A little piece of advice, a little hint of what might happen. It feels like it's talking right to you, but at the same time, it's so general it could apply to pretty much anyone.
And that right there leads to the huge question, doesn't it? I mean, how does the position of a planet, a giant ball of gas hundreds of millions of miles away, have anything to do with whether you're going to reach for some comfort food? What's the system behind all this?
Well, it turns out behind that little daily horoscope, there's this incredibly complex and ancient system. We're talking thousands of years of history, going all the way back to the Babylonians. It is way more than just your sun sign.
So the heart of it is what's called natal astrology. And it's all based on this one core idea, this principle of as above, so below. Basically, the idea is that whatever is happening up there in the cosmos is directly mirrored down here in our lives on Earth.
But how do they make those connections? Well, let's take an example. The sign Aries is traditionally ruled by the planet Mars. In astrology, Mars is all about things like drive, aggression, and impulse. So the thinking goes, if you're in Aries, you're supposed to have those Martian traits baked into your personality.
And it's not just Aries and Mars. You can see here how this whole system builds this giant web of meanings. Every single sign gets linked to a planet, and that planet comes with its own set of traits. And that's the engine that creates all those personality profiles and predictions we see.
Okay, so that's the system in a nutshell. But now let's switch gears. How does all of this hold up when you look at it from a scientific point of view? Have researchers actually tried to test these claims?
You bet they have. And one of the most famous attempts to do this is what's known as the Carlson experiment. It's kind of the gold standard. They got top astrologers to try and match people's natal charts with their psychological profiles. And here's the kicker. The astrologers themselves helped design the study to make sure it was fair. So, what were the results?
Well, the results were pretty eye-opening. The astrologers were correct about 1/3 of the time. Now, you might think, hey, 1/3 isn't bad. But here's the thing. That is the exact same result you would get if you just guessed completely at random. Their performance was literally no better than pure chance.
Yeah, the guy who ran the study, Sean Carlson, he didn't mince words. He said the testing clearly refutes the astrological hypothesis. And look, this wasn't just a one-time thing. This is just one of many, many scientific studies that have found the same thing when they test astrology in a controlled way.
But it's not just about the experimental results. Scientists also point to some, deeper, more fundamental problems with the whole theory of astrology.
Okay, so here's a big one. In science, there's this really important idea called falsifiability. It sounds complicated, but it just means that for a theory to be considered scientific, there has to be a way to prove it wrong. And with astrology, a lot of the claims are just so vague. Like, how do you even test them? That's a huge red flag for scientists and why it often gets labeled a pseudoscience.
Here's another issue, how the system adapts or doesn't. For literally thousands of years, astrology was based on just 7 things you could see in the sky: the sun, the moon, and 5 planets. The system was considered complete. But then, oops, we discovered Uranus, and then Neptune, and then Pluto. And each time, astrologers had to kind of tack them onto the system after the fact.
And that raises some really awkward questions, right? Like, if Pluto was this super powerful astrological influence for 70 years, what happens when it gets demoted to a dwarf planet? Does it just stop working? And what about all the other big dwarf planets out there, like Eris or Makemake? Why don't they count?
And get this, there's also this thing called precession. Basically, the Earth has this tiny little wobble as it spins, kind of like a top that's slowing down. Over the last couple thousand years, that wobble has caused the constellations in the sky to drift.
So the zodiac signs that Western astrology uses are, well, they're out of sync. If your sign is Leo, the sun was probably in the constellation Cancer when you were born.
So, with all these scientific challenges, you'd think astrology would be fading away, right? But it's more popular than ever. So why? Why do we still look to the stars? Well, that brings us to our third and final piece of the puzzle, the psychology behind it all.
I mean, it's not a small number of people. A 2012 poll found that 42% of Americans think astrology is at least partially scientific. So there's clearly something powerful going on here. And psychology gives us some really fascinating clues as to why it feels so true, even if the data says otherwise.
Okay, one of the biggest reasons is something called the Barnum effect. Yep, it's named after P.T. Barnum, the circus guy. It's this weird quirk in our brains where we read a statement that's really vague and general, but we feel like it's a deeply personal and accurate description of us. Our brains are just wired to find personal meaning in things. Remember that horoscope from the beginning? You may indulge in comfort eating. That is a perfect textbook example of a Barnum statement. It feels so specific when you read it, but I mean, who doesn't do that sometimes? It's a universal human thing, which is why it feels right to so many people.
And that effect gets a massive boost from another one of our brain's little habits, confirmation bias. We are all programmed to notice and remember the stuff that proves us right and completely forget all the stuff that proves us wrong. It's like we're detectives who only pay attention to the clues that fit our pet theory. So you remember that one time your horoscope was spookily accurate, and you forget the dozens of times it was totally off?
So this is where it gets really interesting. We're left with this huge paradox, right? On one hand, you have science saying, look, the tests don't work, the theory has holes, but on the other hand, you have millions of people who find real, genuine meaning in it. They use it as a tool to understand themselves and the world around them. And that really brings us to the biggest question of all. Maybe it's not about being right or wrong. Maybe it's about the different tools we use to make sense of our lives. When it comes to understanding who you are, what's more important? A verifiable scientific fact or a powerful story that gives you a sense of meaning? It makes you wonder, what's the right balance between science and story in our own search for answers?